Welcome to the deep dive. We are diving into a topic today that might sound kind of dry at first,
Mhm.
but trust me, it's super fascinating. We're going to be talking about the rules of sailing.
Rules of the road.
Yeah, exactly. The rules of the road, specifically how yachts interact with each other out on the water. It might seem like a bunch of technical jargon, but it's really a window into the world of sailing strategy and, all the anticipation and even the etiquette of how boats are supposed to behave out there.
And sportsmanship, too.
Yeah, definitely sportsmanship plays a huge part in this too. So consider this your insider's guide to understanding the unspoken language of the waves. What happens when these boats cross paths?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a really comprehensive source today that we're drawing from. It's called Okaswoof, and
Okay.
it lays out all the fundamental principles and those really specific details that govern how these encounters on the water are supposed to go down.
Okay, so our mission today is to kind of navigate through this material together
Hmm.
and pull out the really important stuff, the need to know information, so that we can all make sense of those critical moments when yachts converge, whether it's, during a race or even just a casual maneuver.
Right, exactly. Those key moments.
So to get us started, we're going to tackle part one of our source, which is called the basic rules.
Yeah.
Think of these as the foundation, the bedrock principles that everything else is built upon.
The building blocks.
Exactly. And guess what? The very first rule on the list is all about safety,
Of course, got to be safe.
of course. Rule 1.1 basically says that anyone involved in sailing, whether it's, a yacht, a sailor, or even the support crew, has an absolute duty to offer help to anyone or any vessel that's in danger. I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer, right? You got to help someone out
Mhm.
if they're in trouble out on the water.
It's a given, a core principle of seamanship for sure.
Totally. And right alongside that is Rule 1.2, which covers, and this is straight from the source, Nado Miljos, yeah, Brujla, Svosh, Kamokirek, Koyati, Georgia Manjana, Tronzeljal, Kemistamok, Toshma Guyo. Smart.
So in plain English, that's safety equipment and personal flotation devices, life jackets and all that.
Right. So this rule says that a yacht has to have the right safety gear for everyone on board, and at least one piece of gear has to be readily accessible unless, specific class rules say otherwise.
Right, because there might be variations depending on the type of racing.
Exactly. But here's the really important part. It emphasizes that it's up to each individual sailor to actually use a proper personal flotation device based on the conditions. So it's not enough to just have the life jacket stashed away somewhere. You have to actually wear them when it's necessary.
Yeah, that makes total sense. It puts the responsibility on the individual, which is really where it should be.
For sure. So moving on to Rule 2, which is all about fair sportsmanship. This one is super interesting to me because it states that a yacht and its owner have to compete in a way that aligns with the accepted principles of sportsmanship and fair play.
Mm.
But here's the twist. A yacht can actually get penalized under this rule, even if they haven't technically broken any other specific rule, as long as it's super clear that they violated the idea of sportsmanship. And you want to know what the standard penalty is for that.
Qualification, right?
Yep, disqualification. But here's a really unique part. The yacht's race points are not excluded. So it's you're getting penalized for your behavior, not necessarily for your sailing skills.
I think that's fascinating. It's like they're trying to uphold this high standard of ethical behavior without totally wiping out a team's whole performance record.
Exactly. So let's talk about Rule 3, decision to race. This one's pretty straightforward, but incredibly important. Basically, it says that the yacht alone is responsible for deciding whether to participate in a race or if they need to pull out during a race. It's all on the skipper and their judgment call.
Makes sense. They're the ones out there facing the elements and assessing the risks.
Totally. All right, let's move on to Rule 4, acceptance of the rules. This one gets into all the nitty-gritty details of what you're actually agreeing to when you decide to compete.
Like signing a contract.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
So by entering or even intending to enter a competition that's governed by these rules, every sailor, every yacht owner is basically saying, okay, we agree to be bound by these rules. And that includes the sailor's support team, even parents or guardians if a minor's competing.
So it's not just the people on the boat, it's everyone involved.
Yeah, it casts a pretty wide net. And there's some pretty big implications for accepting these rules. You're agreeing to let the rules govern the competition. You're accepting that any penalties or decisions made by the race officials are final. And here's a big one. You're agreeing not to take any disputes outside the framework of these sailing rules. No going to court or anything like that. Oh, and another thing. Rule 4.3 makes it crystal clear that the yacht owner and anyone in charge of the boat has to make sure all the crew members know these rules. Like, they can't be out there clueless, right?
Yeah, everyone needs to be on the same page.
Exactly. And Rule 4.4 just reinforces that responsibility. Oh, and there's a little bit of wiggle room in Rule 4.5. It says that national sailing organizations can actually modify this specific rule about acceptance.
So there's some flexibility built in.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's not totally rigid. Now let's look at Rule 5. Duty to be guided by rules for organizing authorities and officials. This one basically ensures that the folks running this show, like the race committee, the officials, the protest committees, all of them are bound by these same rules in how they manage and judge the competition.
So it's about keeping things fair and consistent for everyone.
Exactly. It's about ensuring that everyone's playing by the same rules, from the sailors all the way up to the organizers. All right, now for Rule 6, which deals with world sailing regulations. This rule basically elevates certain regulations set by world sailing to the same level as the actual racing rules.
So they carry a lot of weight.
Yeah, they do. As of June 30, 2020, these regulations cover things like advertising, anti-doping, betting and corruption, disciplinary actions, eligibility, and how sailors are categorized. So some pretty important stuff. Rule 6.2 clarifies that the normal protest procedure doesn't usually apply to these world sailing regulations unless the specific regulation itself says that protests are allowed.
So it's like they're creating a clear hierarchy of rules.
Definitely. It's a way of ensuring that everyone understands which rules are like the absolute top-level guidelines. Okay, so those were the basic rules. Now things are about to get really interesting because we're moving on to part 2. When yachts meet. This is where we really dive into those close quarters interactions out on the water.
This is what it's all about.
Yeah, this is where it gets real. Now, the key thing to remember here is that the rules in this section mainly apply to yachts that are like in or near the racing area and are either planning to race, are currently racing, or have just finished a race. A yacht that's not racing won't usually get penalized for breaking these rules unless they cause an injury or like some serious damage, or if they mess with a racing yacht in a major way.
So there's a difference between racing and just cruising around.
Exactly. It's like the rules acknowledge that the level of intensity and focus is totally different when you're competing. Now, another really important thing to mention is that when a yacht that's following these racing rules encounters a vessel that's not, like let's say a big commercial ship or recreational powerboat, the international regulations for preventing collisions at sea, usually called IRPCAS, those take over. Those are like the universal traffic laws of the sea.
Right, like you've got to follow the general rules of the road even if you're in a race.
Exactly. Sometimes race organizers might even decide to swap out those IRPCAS rules for the Part 2 racing rules for their specific event. So you might see a slightly different set of guidelines depending on where you're racing.
It's important to always be aware of the specific rules in play.
Absolutely. You got to know the local laws, so to speak.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move into Section A of Part 2, which is all about right-of-way. The basic idea here is that one yacht has to stay out of the way of another yacht. But here's the thing. The sections that follow are going to introduce some limitations on what that right-of-way yacht can actually do. So it's not like a free pass to do whatever you want.
Right, it's a balance of responsibilities.
Exactly. All right, let's dive into the specific rules. Rule 10 covers opposite tacks. This is like a sailing 101 rule, one of the first things you learn. When two yachts are on opposite tacks, meaning the wind's hitting them from different sides, the one on port tack, that's with the wind coming over their left side, has to stay out of the way of the yacht on starboard tack, the one with the wind coming over their right side.
Port gives way to starboard?
Exactly. Think of it like driving. If you're at an intersection and another car is coming from your right, they usually have the right of way. Same idea here.
Helps to prevent chaos on the water.
For sure. Now let's talk about Rule 11. Same tack, overlapped. When two yachts are on the same tack, meaning the wind's hitting them from the same side and they're overlapped, the windward yacht, that's the one closer to where the wind's coming from, has to stay out of the way of the leeward yacht.
The one further downwind.
Right. Now, overlapped basically means if you drew a line straight back from the stern of one boat and it crossed through the other boat, they're overlapped.
Yeah, that's a good way to picture it.
Now for Rule 12, same tack, not overlapped. If two boats are on the same tack but they're not overlapped, the one that's clearly behind, like not even close to being overlapped, has to stay out of the way of the boat that's in front.
Trailing yacht yields to the leading yacht.
Exactly. Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
The boat in back has a better view, and should be able to avoid any weird moves the boat in front might make.
It's like being a courteous driver anticipating what the car ahead might do.
Totally. All right, let's look at Rule 13, tacking. This one's all about what happens when a yacht changes from one tack to another. So after a yacht passes head to wind, which is like when the bow is pointing directly into the wind, it has to stay clear of other yachts until it's settled into a close-hauled course.
Close hauled meaning sailing as close to the wind as possible.
Right. And during this whole tacking process, those other right-of-way rules we talked about, rules 10, 11, and 12, they don't apply.
So it's like a temporary exception while the boat is maneuvering?
Exactly. And there's even a specific rule for when two yachts are tacking at the same time. Basically, the one that was on the other's port side before they started tacking, or the one that was behind, has to stay clear. It's like acknowledging the tacking can be a little bit messy and unpredictable.
Makes sense to have a clear rule for those situations.
Totally. Okay, so we've covered the basic right-of-way rules. Now let's move on to Section B, general limitations. These are super important because they apply to every situation where a yacht has right-of-way.
So these are like the caveats, the fine print.
Exactly. The first one is Rule 14, avoiding contact. This one seems obvious, right? You got to avoid hitting other boats if you can. But here's the catch. A yacht that has right-of-way, or one that's entitled to room or mark room, which we'll get to later, doesn't have to do anything to avoid contact until it's crystal clear that the other yacht isn't staying clear or giving them enough space.
So it's about not overreacting, but also being ready to act if the other boat isn't doing what it's supposed to.
Right. It's like you can assume the other boat's going to follow the rules, but you also have to be prepared to take action if they don't.
It's a balance for sure.
Totally. Now, for Rule 15, acquiring right-of-way. This one basically says that if a yacht suddenly gets right-of-way, it can't just immediately force another boat into a tight spot. They have to give them some time and space to react. It's like you can't just cut someone off and expect them to slam on the brakes.
Right, you have to give them a chance to adjust.
Exactly. Now, there's an exception to this rule, which is if the other yacht messed up, and that's what caused the change in right-of-way. In that case, they can't expect the yacht that now has right-of-way to, like, bend over backward to accommodate them.
It's like you can't cause a problem and then complain that someone else isn't fixing it for you.
For sure. Okay, Rule 16, changing course. This one's pretty straightforward. If a yacht with right-of-way changes course, it has to give the other yacht enough room to stay clear. So having right-of-way doesn't mean you can just swerve all over the place.
It's about predictability and not making sudden, dangerous moves.
Right. There's also a special addition to this rule that applies to those windward-leeward situations, which are super common in racing. If a port tack yacht is staying clear by passing downwind of a starboard tack yacht, the starboard tack yacht can't suddenly turn downwind if it would force the port tack yacht to change course to keep staying clear. It's like, hey, you already established a safe path. Don't try to block them now.
Yeah, it's about preventing dangerous close calls, especially in tight racing situations.
Now, on to Rule 17. Same tack. Proper course. This one can be a bit tricky, and sailors often debate it. It says that if a leeward yacht, the one further downwind, gets within 2 boat lengths behind a windward yacht while they're both on the same tack, the leeward yacht can't sail above its proper course while they're that close, unless they immediately pass behind the windward yacht.
So the leeward yacht can't just sail higher and higher to try and gain an advantage.
Exactly. But here's where it gets a little fuzzy. What exactly is a proper course? Well, the rule defines it as the course a yacht would sail to finish the race as quickly as possible if the other yacht wasn't there. So it's kind of subjective, right?
Yeah, it can be tough to determine what a boat's proper course really is in the heat of a race.
Totally. And that's why this rule often sparks a lot of debate. Sailors will argue about whether a leeward yacht's move was a genuine attempt to sail faster or just a sneaky tactic to mess with the windward yacht.
Right. It's like trying to read their intentions, which can be tough.
Absolutely. Now, there's one exception to this rule, which is if the overlap started when the windward yacht was in the middle of tacking. In that case, the leeward yacht doesn't have to worry about sailing above its proper course. It's like saying, okay, the windward yacht's already dealing with their own maneuver. Let's not make things more complicated.
Sounds reasonable.
Now we're sailing into Section C, at marks and obstructions. First things first. These rules generally don't apply to starting marks that are surrounded by water that boats can sail through. This exception covers the whole time from when the boats are approaching the starting line until they've completely passed the starting marks.
So it's like a special set of rules for the starting line.
Exactly. The starting line can be total chaos with so many boats crammed together, so it needs its own specific rules.
Huh.
All right, let's talk about Rule 18, mark room. This is a big one with lots of little details.
This sounds important.
Oh, it is. It's all about ensuring that boats can round marks safely and fairly, especially because marks are often where things get really congested. So Rule 18.1 tells us exactly when this mark room rule applies. It's between boats that are required to round the mark on the same side, and when at least one of those boats is inside a zone around the mark. Usually this zone is defined as being within 3 boat lengths of the mark.
Okay, so if you're within that zone, the mark room rules come into play.
Exactly. But there are a few situations where mark room doesn't apply, like if the boats are on opposite tacks and sailing toward the mark, or if they're on opposite tacks and only one of them would need to tack at the mark, or one boat's approaching the mark and the other one's already rounded it and is sailing away. And one more thing. If the thing they're approaching isn't a mark, but is instead what they call an extended obstruction, then different rules apply, and we'll talk about those later. Oh, and one really important thing to remember is that as soon as a yacht gets the mark room it needs, the rule stops applying.
So it's not like a permanent right-of-way situation?
Exactly. It's about giving enough space to make the turn safely, and once that's done, we're back to the normal rules. All right, now for the nitty-gritty details of how to actually give mark room, which is covered in Rule 18.2. This rule lays out all these specific scenarios and who has to do what.
This sounds complicated.
It can be. So if the boats are overlapped, when the first one reaches that 3-boat length zone around the mark, the boat that's on the outside at that exact moment has to give the inside boat room. Same thing if one boat's clearly ahead when it gets to the zone. The boat that's clearly behind at that moment has to give the boat in front room. The boat that's required to give room has to keep giving it, even if the overlap changes or new overlap happens. It's like you can't just suddenly stop giving room because the situation shifted a little bit.
Makes sense. You have to be consistent.
Right. And the inside boat that's getting room also has to give the outside boat enough space to sail its own proper course while they're still overlapped. It's like, hey, you're getting room, but you can't box the other boat in.
Sort of two-way street.
Totally. Now, the rule also specifies when these obligations end, which is usually after a yacht passes head to wind if it's an upwind mark, or when they've sailed out of that zone around the mark.
So it's not forever, just while they're in that critical zone.
Exactly. Oh, and there's this whole thing about what they call an untimely overlap, which is when a boat tries to sneak in and claim an overlap at the very last second to get mark room that they didn't really earn. The rule says that if there's any doubt about whether the overlap was established in time, then it doesn't count.
It's like saying, nice try, but you can't game the system.
Right. The rule's trying to prevent those last-minute maneuvers that aren't really fair play. And then there are a few exceptions for when a boat gets an inside overlap really late, like from way behind or by attacking right before the mark. If the outside boat couldn't possibly give them room because the overlap happened so suddenly, then they don't have to.
So there's some flexibility built in for those unusual situations.
Exactly. It's a super detailed rule, but it's all about making sure things are fair and safe around those marks. Okay, let's talk about Rule 18.3, which is specifically about tacking inside that 3-boat length zone around a mark. If a port tack yacht tack onto starboard tack inside that zone and then sails toward the mark, it can't force a starboard tack yacht that's already been on starboard tack since it entered the zone to sail above a close-hauled course just to avoid them. And after tacking, the port tack yacht has to give mark room if it ends up on the inside of that starboard tack yacht. But in this situation, that standard mark room rule we talked about earlier doesn't apply between these two specific yachts. It's like a special case for a very common tactic at marks.
So they're acknowledging a specific maneuver and making sure it doesn't create an unfair advantage.
Exactly. Now, for Rule 18.4, which is about jibing at a mark, jibing is when you change tacks by swinging the stern of the boat through the wind. So this rule says that if a boat on the inside of an overlap has right-of-way and needs to jibe to round the mark and stay on course, it can't sail any further away from the mark than it absolutely needs to until after it's finished jibing. This rule is all about making sure the inside boat doesn't sail extra wide just to set up for its jibe, which would block other boats trying to round the mark too.
So it's about keeping the turning radius tight and predictable.
Right. It's like Don't make a wider turn than you need to. But this particular rule doesn't apply to gate marks, which are kind of a different beast.
Right, gates have their own unique considerations.
Okay, let's look at Rule 19. Room to pass an obstruction. This one's all about what happens when two or more boats are sailing towards something that they need to avoid, like a buoy that's not part of the course, or a moored boat, or even an area of shallow water. But here's the thing. This rule doesn't apply if that obstruction is a mark that both boats need to round on the same side, or if the mark room rule is already in effect. The rule always applies, though, when the thing they need to avoid is what they call an extended obstruction, like a shoreline or a really long pier. Those are situations where the usual mark room rules just wouldn't make sense.
So it's about adapting the rules to different types of obstacles.
Exactly. Now let's talk about how they're supposed to give each other room when they're approaching one of these obstructions. Rule 19.2 says that the boat that has right-of-way gets to pick which side it wants to pass the obstruction on. Pretty straightforward, right? But if they're overlapped, the outside boat has to give the inside boat enough space to squeeze between it and the obstruction.
Makes sense. The outside boat has more options.
Right. Now, there's an exception to that, of course. If the outside boat has been unable to give room from the moment the overlap started, and it doesn't have to. It's like, hey, I couldn't move over even if I wanted to.
Right, sometimes there's just not enough space.
And then there's this very specific rule for when a boat that was way behind and had to stay clear suddenly ends up overlapped on the inside of another boat right next to an extended obstruction. If there wasn't enough room for that inside boat when the overlap happened, then it's still on them to keep clear. It's like you can't suddenly demand room that wasn't there before just because you snuck into an inside position.
It's about preventing risky maneuvers near those big obstacles.
For sure. All right, we're on to the final section, Section D. Other rules. These are kind of like the miscellaneous rules that cover very specific situations. The important thing to know about these rules is that the usual right-of-way rules we talk about in Section A, Rules 10 through 13, don't apply when these other rules are in effect.
So these are like the exceptions to the exception.
Yeah, exactly. They take priority over the regular right-of-way rules in very particular situations. Okay, Rule 20, room to tack at an obstruction. This one says that in certain cases, a yacht can actually yell out, like literally hail, another yacht to ask for room to tack, but only if they're both on the same tack, and if the yacht asking for room is approaching an obstruction and is going to need to make a big turn to avoid hitting it. They also have to be sailing as close to the wind as they can. But, and this is important, they can't hail for room to tack if the obstruction they're trying to avoid is a mark of the course that the other boat would also have to change course to avoid. This is to prevent boats from using this rule as a sneaky tactic to gain an advantage.
So it has to be a legitimate need to avoid an obstacle, not just a way to mess with your competitor.
Exactly. Now, there's a whole process for how this hailing is supposed to work, which is laid out in Rule 20.2. Basically, the boat that wants to tack has to give the other boat enough time to react to their hail, and the hailed boat has to respond even if the hail wasn't totally by the book. And they have two options, either tack as soon as they can or say, you tack, and then give the other boat enough space to tack. And once the hailed boats responded, the boat that wanted to tack has to tack as soon as possible. So like a little back and forth conversation on the water. And while this whole thing is going on, that mark room rule we talked about earlier doesn't apply between these two boats.
It's like a temporary pause on those other rules while they sort out this tacking situation.
Exactly. And then there's Rule 20.3, which covers relaying a hail. So if one boat hails another for room to tack and the second boat also needs to tack, they can hail a third boat that's also on the same tack. It's like a chain reaction of tacking requests.
Like a domino effect.
Totally. Now, because sometimes yelling might not be enough, especially if it's windy or there's a lot of noise, Rule 20.4 says that yachts also have to make a clear visual signal to show they need room to tack or to communicate their response. Plus, race organizers can even decide that boats have to use a different way to communicate, like radios.
So it's all about making sure those communications are clear and reliable.
For sure. All right, Rule 21. This one covers a few very specific situations. First, if a boat's sailing toward the wrong side of the starting line after the starting signal, either because they started too early or had to go back and restart, they have to stay out of the way of any boat that's not doing the same thing until they've completely crossed back over the line.
So it's like they're acknowledging that boats in those situations are in a vulnerable position.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then there's a rule that says a boat taking a penalty has to stay clear of any boat that's not also taking a penalty. And finally, if a boat's moving backward or sideways toward the wind because its sails are catching the wind on the wrong side, they have to stay out of the way of boats that aren't doing the same thing.
Yeah.
It's like if you're in a weird situation, you're the one who has to be extra careful.
Makes sense. You're the one who's not behaving normally.
Exactly. Okay, Rule 22. Yacht capsized, anchored, or aground, giving help. This one basically says that if a yacht is capsized, meaning its mast is in the water, or if it's anchored or stuck on the bottom, or if it's trying to help someone or another boat that's in trouble, then all the other boats have to avoid them if at all possible.
Like safety first.
Totally. It's a basic rule of seamanship that you don't get in the way of boats that are disabled or involved in a rescue. All right, last rule, Rule 23. Interfering with other yachts. This one has two parts. The first part says that a boat that's not racing can't get in the way of a boat that is racing, if it's at all possible to avoid it. So you can't just go cruising through a race course and mess everyone up. The second part says that a boat can't interfere with a boat that's taking a penalty, or one that's on a different leg of the course, or one that's dealing with those starting line issues we talked about earlier, again, if it's possible to avoid it. But, and here's the important part, once the race is started, this rule doesn't apply if the non-interfering boat is sailing its own proper course.
So it's like saying, okay, once the race is on, you have to stay out of the way, but we're not expecting you to completely stop sailing just because there's a race happening.
Exactly. It's about finding a balance between the needs of the racing boats and the rights of other boats to use the same waterway.
Makes sense.
So there you have it. The Rules of the Road, Sailing Edition. I know it was a lot of information, but I think the key takeaway is that these rules are really about making sure everyone stays safe out there, that the competition is fair, and that everyone's on the same page about how boats should interact. Whether you're in a race or just enjoying a casual sail, these rules help make sure things run smoothly.
Yeah, it creates a common language for sailors to understand each other.
Exactly. It's like learning the rules of the road, but for boats. It helps to avoid confusion and prevent accidents.
Absolutely. And the level of detail in those rules, especially when you get into things like mark room and tacking at obstructions, it really highlights how much strategy and thought goes into maneuvering a sailboat, especially in close quarters.
It's true. Those situations can get pretty complex, and knowing the rules is what keeps things from turning into total chaos.
It's like a chess game on the water almost.
Totally. And for our listeners, I think this deep dive has given you a solid foundation for understanding what's going on out there when you see those yachts crossing paths.
It's like you've gained a whole new level of appreciation for the sport.
Exactly. So here's a question to ponder as we wrap up. What do you think is the most challenging scenario for yachts encountering each other on the water? And how do you think the rules we talked about play into that?
I'm curious to hear what our listeners come up with. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of sailing rules.